This never should have happened. Jeju Air Flight 2216 was moments away from landing when something went terribly wrong. The pilot declared mayday and said they hit a bird. Moments later, the aircraft landed on the runway with the landing gear and flaps still retracted. It seemed like they would be fine, but they were going too fast and they went off the end of the runway and crashed, killing almost everyone on board. This was a horrific tragedy, and there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and that's why we're going to focus on the facts and the truth about what really happened. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. I want to start by taking a moment to remember the lives that were lost in this terrible disaster. I know that the family and friends of the victims are desperately searching for answers, and it's hard to imagine having to endure the loss of a loved one over the holidays, especially when it's due to an unexpected tragedy such as this, and my heart and prayers go out to them. Jeju Air Flight 2216 was supposed to be a routine domestic flight from Bangkok, Thailand to the Muan International Airport in South Korea. The total flight time was about 4 hours and 30 minutes, and the aircraft being flown was a Boeing 737-800. Now, the 737 is a very popular twin-engine medium-range commercial airliner, and it was being operated by 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants and was carrying 175 passengers. It's important to understand that the 737-800, which is part of the next generation series of 737 aircraft, is not the same as the Boeing 737 MAX that was grounded from March 2019 until December 2020 after 346 people died in 2 separate crashes that took place within 5 months of each other. If you haven't heard of Jeju Air before, they're a low-cost airline in South Korea with an excellent safety record that has been operating for 19 years, and this is the first fatal crash in the history of the airline. Unfortunately, it's now the deadliest aviation tragedy to take place on South Korean soil, and the second deadliest in South Korean history, the first being Korean Air Flight 801 that crashed in Guam in 1997, killing 224 people on board. According to initial reports, the captain of the flight had been an employee of Jeju Air since 2019, and he had over 6,800 hours of experience, while the first officer had over 1,600 hours. Regardless of the number of flight hours they had, the investigation will look at their training history, they'll do toxicology tests, but more importantly, they need to find out how well the pilots worked together in the cockpit and whether there were any crew resource management issues, also known as CRM, that could have affected what happened during the flight. One of the issues that we saw in the Korean Air 801 tragedy was a failure of the first officer and the flight engineer to challenge the captain when he was making critical mistakes, and this was largely due to a cultural issue where the captain was viewed as always being right. Now, I'm not suggesting this was a problem with the Jeju Air pilots, it's just something that's going to be looked at. The other issue that could be a significant factor is fatigue. Jeju Air departed from Bangkok at 2:28 a.m. local time, which was 4:28 a.m. in Korea. I think that's probably one of the worst times to take off because your body's circadian rhythm causes you to be the most tired between 2 and 4 a.m. So the question is, how much rest did the crew get before the flight? They could have been very tired by the time they tried to land, and that could have played a small role in their decision making. We're going to talk more about the pilots later, but for now, to better understand how this could have happened, we need to take a look at the airport they were landing at. Muan International Airport is located on the southwest end of South Korea and opened in November of 2007, and it was intended to serve as a regional hub, but critics say the development of the airport was largely politically driven. In fact, despite initial projections of 9.9 million annual passengers, only about 500,000 passengers used the airport in 2018, and that has since dropped to just 246,000 in 2023. Just for reference, over 100 million passengers use the Incheon Airport near Seoul every year. The Muan Airport only features one runway, and that's runway 0119, which is 2,800 meters or 9,186 feet long. That might seem short for an international airport. However, depending on the landing weight and runway conditions, the 737 can land on runways as short as 1,500 meters or 4,900 feet long, so the runway at the Muan Airport was more than long enough under normal circumstances. When it comes to the investigation, there are 3 main issues with this airport that need to be considered. The first is the role that the tower controllers played in all of this. The reason I bring this up is because until December of 2024, the airport hadn't hosted regular international flights, and the Jeju Air Flight was part of a new route from Muan to Bangkok that launched on December 8th, about 20 days prior to the tragedy. So critics have questioned whether the airport was operationally ready, considering it had kind of been declining in service volume over recent years. Did the tower controllers know the aircraft was about to land without the landing gear extended? And if so, did they try to warn the pilots? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to blame the controllers. I'm just saying that the investigators are probably going to review their qualifications and their training history, but also their communications to see if there was anything that could have been done better. The second issue with this airport that was a factor in this mishap was the number of birds in the area. The Muan International Airport has the highest bird strike rate among all of South Korea's airports, with 10 incidents over the last 5 years. Now that's not a huge number, but the rate of incidents is 0.09%, which is about 8 times as high as nearby airports. The reason it's so high is because there are several bird habitats located nearby that can pose a threat to aircraft taking off or landing. As a side note, when I was flying the F-15E and was the chief of wing safety, we had a very active bird hazard program that we used to protect aircraft. During the peak migratory season, we would reduce or prohibit aircraft from taking off or landing around sunrise when birds are most active because it wasn't worth the risk of a bird strike. Now, I'm only bringing that up because the Jeju flight was trying to land at 9 a.m. local time, which was about 1 hour and 10 minutes after sunrise, so right at the end of the peak window for bird activity. There are also other ways to reduce the number of birds around the airport, such as sound cannons, lasers, and a few other tools, and previous assessments at the Muan airport had recommended the use of some of those measures, but allegedly implementation had been delayed. In fact, it's already been reported that Korean regulations required a staff of 4 personnel to drive away birds from the airport, but only 1 was on duty at the time of the crash. So we're already starting to see how all the holes in the Swiss cheese are lining up, and that brings us to the biggest problem with this airfield. The third issue with this airport, which was a huge threat, was the construction design of the runway end safety area. This is an area typically 500 feet wide, extending 300 meters or 1,000 feet beyond the end of the runway that should be graded appropriately in case of an aircraft overrun. When construction on the Muan airport began in 1999, the ICAO standards said that the area 60 meters from the end of the runway threshold is the limit of the runway strip, illustrated by the red dashed line, and the runway end safety area is required to extend 90 meters beyond that, but they recommend 240 meters, which would be a total of 300 meters or about 1,000 feet from the end of the runway. Additionally, any equipment within that area, such as ILS antennas or lighting, must be mounted on frangible supports. That means they're going to break off or give way if they're struck by an aircraft. Now, when it comes to the Jeju crash, although the ILS equipment might have been frangible, it was installed on very thick reinforced concrete on a dirt mound located only about 250 meters from the end of the runway. Now, technically, even if it was 300 meters from the end of the runway, it probably would have been the same outcome. But the truth is that there's just no reason for this. The problem is that when they built the airport, they wanted to put the ILS antennas more level with the runway. So instead of buying taller antennas or grading the terrain, they built a big mound of dirt and concrete. The sad truth is that if it wasn't for that berm, the aircraft would have continued ahead through a perimeter wall, which is probably made of hollow cinder blocks, and the damage likely would have resulted in a much lower number of casualties. I also want to point out that tragically, if the aircraft had landed on runway 01 to the north, it doesn't appear as if there's any obstacles off the end of that runway that would have been a factor, and perhaps they all would have survived. This was just a horrific tragedy, but now that you understand a little bit more about the airport and why so many people died, we need to talk about how the aircraft got into that situation in the first place and what happened during the final moments of the flight. Two of the most critical pieces of evidence for this investigation are the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. Both of those were recovered from the crash site, but it could take several months before all of that is released. In the meantime, the aircraft was transmitting ADS-B data that's available to the public through websites such as Flight Radar 24, and based on that information, here's what you need to know. If the aircraft was flying a normal 3-degree glide path to land, then they would be at 1,700 feet, about 5 nautical miles from the end of the runway. However, according to the data, at 8:56:51, the pilots were at 1,700 feet when they were 6 nautical miles from the runway, so they were slightly low on the approach, but everything was stable, and they were descending at a rate of about 750 feet per minute with a ground speed of 144 knots, which would be consistent with the landing gear and at least some of the flaps extended. At 8:57, the tower made a radio call warning the pilots about birds, saying something like, "Use caution for bird activity." And about 30 seconds later, the pilots made a slight turn to the right and then corrected back to the left to resume course. This could have been to avoid some birds, but they maintained a stable airspeed and rate of descent until 8:57:50 when they pushed the nose over, and at 8:58 their rate of descent was just over 1,200 feet per minute. Once again, this could have been a maneuver to avoid the birds, but what happened next is the most interesting part. That's because starting at 8:58:21, they were only 2 nautical miles from the end of the runway and at an altitude of 450 feet above the ground. That's about 200 feet low on the approach, and for some reason, for the next 7 seconds, they rapidly transitioned to an 1,800 foot per minute rate of climb before descending back down and then leveling off a few seconds later. It's not clear why they made the climb and then leveled off, but the data stopped at 8:58 and 50 seconds, and it was 8:59 when the pilot made a radio call saying, "Mayday, mayday, mayday. Bird strike, bird strike, bird strike, go around." This video shows Jeju Air on final approach to runway 01, and you can see the moment that a compressor stall happens, which was most likely caused by a bird going through the engine disrupting the airflow. However, it's really important to understand that the bird strike could have happened earlier, and this isn't necessarily a video of the bird strike. In this other angle of the footage, if you zoom in on the compressor stall, it looks like the flaps are at least partially extended, and it seems like the landing gear is already retracted, but it's not possible to tell that for sure. Now, I know that when people saw this video, there was a lot of focus on the right engine, but you'll also need to keep in mind that the left engine and other parts of the aircraft could have been damaged because of the bird strike, and we're just not able to see it in the video. In fact, one of the reasons why the ADS-B data could have stopped is due to an electrical surge or failure, which is something else the pilots might have had to deal with. Either way, aircraft engines are designed to be able to withstand a bird strike, and even if that right engine was severely damaged and stopped producing thrust, the 737 is more than capable of flying on just one engine. Another point worth bringing up is that if you're configured to land and fly in a stable approach and you have a bird strike, then in most cases the safest thing to do is to continue straight ahead and land. That's because you don't know what kind of damage the birds have done to the gear and flaps, so if you try to raise those during a go-around, you could be making the problem worse. Now, I'm not saying this to question anything the pilots did in this scenario. None of us were there, we don't know what happened or what they saw. But I think it's important to talk about some of these possibilities so we know what the investigation is going to look for in this tragedy. If we go back to the data, I think maybe this rapid change in vertical speed could have been the result of the pilots initiating a go-around before they hit any birds. I obviously don't know that for sure, but that would explain why the landing gear looks like it's retracted in the video, and that could also be the reason why they didn't land on runway 01. They just weren't in a safe position to do so. In fact, it wasn't until about 30 seconds after this maneuver that the pilot called mayday and reported a bird strike. And the plane crashed into the berm at 9:03, just 4 minutes later. And that brings us to the landing. According to the Korean news, the pilots offset the runway to the west and made a right-hand turn to circle back and land on runway 19. If that's true, I'm wondering who was flying the aircraft, because if it was the captain, then it would have been very hard for him to maintain sight of the runway, and he would need to rely on the first officer to tell him when to turn, and he could have started his turn back towards the runway too early. The reason this is important is because it could help explain why this approach was so rushed and how they ended up high and fast. The landing itself was caught on camera from 2 different angles. In this first video, the aircraft is seen making a relatively stable approach to the runway. However, because the landing gear and flaps are retracted, they're going very fast. In fact, the no-flap landing speed of the 737 is around 200 knots, which is about 55 knots faster than normal. Another problem is that without the gear and flaps, you have a lot less drag on the aircraft, so when the pilot flares, there's nothing to slow them down, and they floated in ground effect and didn't actually touch down until about 1,200 meters or almost 4,000 feet down the runway, which is almost halfway down the runway. Now, if you're wondering why the landing gear and the flaps aren't down, so is everyone else. That's because the 737 has a very redundant hydraulic system that supplies the hydraulic power necessary for the gear and flaps. A bird strike to one engine wouldn't normally cause the kind of damage that would eliminate the primary and backup hydraulic systems. It's just an extremely unlikely scenario, but even if it did happen, the pilots still have an alternate means to lower the flaps and the gear, but both of those procedures require going through the checklist, and the manual gear extension is only available via a small handle and a door on the floor near the first officer's seat, so it's just not possible to do that in the short amount of time they had. Additionally, in this other video of their landing, you can see the thrust reverser deployed on the right engine. That requires hydraulic power, so it doesn't make sense that the pilots would have hydraulic power for the thrust reversers, but the landing gear and flaps would still be retracted. And just in case you were wondering, the thrust reversers on the 737-800 don't require weight on wheels to operate. You just need to be less than 10 feet above the ground, and that was proven to be true when a 737 operated by Ryanair deployed their thrust reversers moments before they landed. Now, it's also worth pointing out that the way the heat and air conditioning system is designed on the 737, if you have a bird strike in the right engine, that could cause smoke and fumes in the cabin, but if a bird hits the left engine, that would cause smoke and fumes in the cockpit. And this is something else the investigation will need to take a look at, because if you have smoke in the cockpit, you're doing everything you can to land as quickly as possible. But that still doesn't explain why the gear and the flaps were retracted. Before I show you probably the most important clues in these videos, let me just say that I always do my best to avoid speculating, and I debated whether or not to even make this video when we don't have the results of a full investigation. However, I know people are searching for answers, and I hope you found value in this, as I've tried to be respectful while presenting things in a way that highlights the areas the investigation will focus on. If we go back to the first video, you can see that it looks like there's a slight yaw to the left as the aircraft is descending to land, which would indicate that perhaps the right engine is still producing some thrust, but maybe the left one isn't. Also, what's interesting is that if you look closely, you can see the disturbance of air from the exhaust coming from the right engine, but we don't see that on the left engine, so maybe the left engine wasn't producing any thrust at this point. In the second video, even though the right thrust reverser appears deployed, the left one doesn't, but it's very hard to tell that for sure, so once again, it's not clear if the left engine is working or not. That's why the investigation will need to take a close look at the left engine to determine whether it was operating when they landed. If it wasn't, why not? Was it damaged in the bird strike, or did the pilots panic and accidentally shut down the wrong engine? Because the truth is that if the left engine wasn't working and the right engine was also damaged, then the pilots would have likely been trying to preserve airspeed to have as much glide distance as possible to make it back to the runway. That would mean keeping the gear retracted until landing is assured, but it doesn't explain why they wouldn't at least lower some of the flaps to help reduce their landing speed. However, the situation could have just been so chaotic with all the warnings going off that they simply forgot to lower the gear and flaps. Either way, I want to be clear when I say that we need to wait for the full investigation, and considering how difficult things probably were for the pilots, they still managed to safely get the aircraft back on the ground, and if it wasn't for the dirt and concrete berm at the end of the runway, then everyone still might be alive today. I'll make a follow-up video once we have more details from the investigation and put a link to it on the screen here. But in the meantime, if you want to learn about the pilot mistakes that caused the 10 deadliest aviation disasters in history, including the story of Korean Air Flight 801, then be sure to check out this video using the link on the screen, and I'll see you on the next debrief.